Hey guys, welcome back to History with Mrs. Lee. Today we're going to be looking at three major court cases of the Supreme Court that featured Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, if you've been in my class long enough, you know that I want you to remember John Marshall as a big old muscle man like the Hulk, even if he really didn't look like that. Because if John Marshall was on the case, then most likely he voted in favor of strengthening the federal government. Now, the three court cases we're going to be looking at today are Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, and Gibbons v. Ogden. The first case that we're going to look at is Marbury v. Madison, which happened in 1803, shortly after Thomas Jefferson became president. You guys know the background story that basically Marbury had been issued a position to be a judge. However, he did not receive that piece of paper before midnight on the last night of Adams' presidency, and then Madison, once he found out about it, refused to give Marbury this position, this job. And so Marbury sues, and this goes to the Supreme Court. However, at the Supreme Court, John Marshall and his fellow judges, they agree that judicial review should happen. Supreme Court should be able to decide if laws are constitutional. And so they decided ultimately they could not give Marbury this position as a judge because they didn't have the power to do so. So judicial review, Supreme Court decides if laws are constitutional. John Marshall and the Supreme Court strengthened the Supreme Court and federal government in this case. Now, it is important to remember that judicial review is only going to be used when Supreme Court cases are seen. And Supreme Court cases are not seen unless somebody decides that they think the law is bad in the country. And it could be a year after the law has been passed. It could be 20 years after the law has been passed. But the Supreme Court is not going to hear cases unless somebody argues with a law that was passed by the federal government, and it will be brought up for the Supreme Court to decide with judicial review. Okay, so Marbury v. Madison is important because now judicial review is going to be used by the Supreme Court to make decisions in future court cases. So let's move on to the second court case that featured John Marshall on the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. And I remember McCulloch v. Maryland because I say MM money. It's all about the national bank and taxes. Basically, the federal government had created a national bank branch in the state of Maryland, and Maryland was very unhappy about this, and they decided to tax the national bank. They said, if you're a business in our state, then you should have to pay state taxes. Well, the federal government felt they should not have to pay taxes because they're the federal government. So this goes to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall is one of the Supreme Court judges, and they ultimately decide that the national bank was necessary and proper and that states could not tax the federal government. Ultimately, this proved that federal law is greater than state laws. So any laws passed by the federal government, states would also have to follow. Okay, moving on to our last Supreme Court case during this time period. We are looking at Gibbons versus Ogden, and my memory trick is G-O, steamships go. Alright, so Ogden had a license from the state of New York to operate his steamboat. But Gibbons was a competitor, and he had a license from the federal government. Ogden is very unhappy that Gibbons is using his steamship on the same river, and so they take this to the Supreme Court. Again, John Marshall is sitting on the Supreme Court at this time, and so you know he loves the federal government, so he's obviously going to vote in favor of the federal government. Basically, it was decided that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. And we discussed in class that interstate means that this is happening in more than one state, and commerce means business. So, for example, today, Taco Bell is in more than just Texas. It's in multiple states. So, Texas is not going to be imposing or regulating certain laws on Taco Bell since it is in different locations. Only the federal government, the United States government, could make rules for Taco Bell since it's in multiple states. And again, John Marshall and the Supreme Court proved that the federal government and the federal laws were going to be stronger than the state government and state laws. Now, you are not usually asked about specific cases. You could be, but not always. Sometimes they will ask you about Marbury versus Madison, and it's so important to know judicial review. But usually, you will be asked a question that lumps these three court cases together. Now, aside from them all involving strong John Marshall, you could say that all three have in common the fact that the federal government is strengthened in each of these court cases.